Buggy became an Emperor of the Sea by recruiting powerful free agents such as Mihawk to join his fleet. Why do I say that? Why do I believe that Buggy made some big off-season moves to up his standing in the pirate world? Why do I think it doesn't make sense for him to have become an emperor without getting some major new recruits? And who do I think joined during these past 7 days? Before we get into it, make sure to subscribe. And make sure to subscribe to Grand Line Review and Sensei Inc. because the raid succeeded. So in general, most people have accepted that Buggy became an emperor simply because it's Buggy. He's a gag character. His whole shtick is that he keeps falling upwards into higher and higher positions of power, first becoming the de facto leader of the Impel Down jailbreak gang, then becoming a Shichibukai with a pirate fleet of his own, and now finally even becoming a Yonko, the highest pirate title you can get aside from Pirate King. So most people are saying don't think too much about it, it's just a running gag, and I would agree, but the thing is that Buggy's running gag of falling upwards into higher positions of power also always makes logical sense. That's why the gag works. It's a weird series of events that lead to Buggy believably attaining a much higher status than he deserves. That's what's so funny. A few lies here or there, and suddenly his influence is snowballing out of his own control, and we can logically understand why the world government would now suddenly see him as such a big deal that they would make Buggy, of all people, a Shichibukai. If you just took East Blue Buggy with his original crew and said, well, off-screen, the world government just made him a Shichibukai because it's a gag, well, it wouldn't really make sense. The gag is that something happens that skews people's perceptions of Buggy to believe that he is a bigger deal than he actually is. So, considering the jump in status from Shichibukai to full-blown Yonko, which up till now was basically the most sacred pirate title in the world, there is likely something that happened in the last 7 days that we will find out about that suddenly made Buggy seem like a much, much bigger deal than he was previously viewed as. Because as it stands, the Buggy that we saw before this would never have been called an emperor. I've seen people say that, no, this makes sense because, Buggy has a fleet, Kid-in-Law might be stronger than Buggy, but they don't have territories or influence like Buggy does, and that's why Buggy was the only pirate left who could be made an emperor. That's not really true, because yes, having some numbers under you is technically a part of being an emperor, but just having a fleet does not make anyone an emperor on its own. Being an emperor means that you and your crew are a force so powerful that you threaten the balance of the world itself. You literally rule a section of the New World because the Marines cannot and do not challenge you, because to do so would require way too much manpower. We've seen this time and again, that any action between an emperor versus another emperor, or emperor versus the Marines, is clearly extremely dangerous since the armies involved are so strong that any battle would leave any party involved vulnerable to being taken out by one of the other major forces. That's kind of the level that has to be hit. The emperor title is really not given out lightly. To be an emperor, you literally have to have so much manpower that the Marines and other emperors would lose a tremendous amount of their forces trying to fight you. That's what makes a pirate an emperor of the sea, being able to actually hold an empire. And Buggy's fleet, the last that we saw it, is nowhere near that. And in fact, that is easily observable in the manga itself. Factually, the last that we saw of Buggy's fleet of fodder is they were literally about to be casually wiped out by some Marines. It's not really debatable, it's just a fact in the story that Buggy's fleet was screwed the moment some Marines, any Marines, decided to take them out. It's not like they sent an admiral or anything, it's just a random vice admiral leading the charge, and Buggy knows they are pretty much cooked. That is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a Yonko level crew. We know how the Marines treat actual Yonko level crews. Because what everyone is forgetting is that yes, Buggy technically has numbers, but it's pretty much entirely fodder by New World standards. His fleet is extremely, ridiculously weak. We knew this even before we saw the Marines decide to wipe them out. We knew Buggy's fleet was extremely weak the moment we were told that Buggy's absolute best fighter was Hadrudin. That's right, Hadrudin. Think about that for a moment. Buggy's absolute S-tier squad, his best mercenaries in his entire fleet, was literally just Hadrudin and Hadrudin's subordinates. That was the absolute elite of the elite of what Buggy was working with. That was Buggy's S-Class. A dude that base Luffy could casually one-shot even before he was good at hockey. A dude that was getting wrecked by one of Doflamingo's weakest officers and barely won after breaking nearly every bone in his body. That was Buggy's strongest guy. And the keyword is was, because the craziest thing is, Hajrudin and his giants aren't even in Buggy's fleet anymore. They left. Like, I don't think this can be stressed enough. Forget competing with an actual Yonko empire. You could take a random mid-tier officer from Doflamingo's crew, and they could probably easily walk through Buggy's entire fleet with zero difficulty. So yes, Buggy has a fleet, but it is pretty much entirely fodder. So when people say that Buggy being an emperor now makes sense because he has a fleet whereas Kid and Law don't, well, that would be kind of like saying that Orlumbus should be considered an emperor or Qinzhao should be considered an emperor. Having numbers on its own doesn't really mean anything. I mean, we saw random low-level Big Mom pirates casually waltz through and destroy entire kingdoms on their own. And Buggy's pirate crew would suffer exactly the same fate, considering, again, Hajrudin and his giants were the best that they had, and they aren't even there anymore. Basically, while Buggy is a gag character, let's not forget that there is some internal story logic here that suggests that something must have changed with his situation that made people start considering him an emperor, because the Marines were clearly not giving him that respect beforehand just because he had a fleet. And as we've seen throughout the story, being called an emperor takes a ridiculous level of perceived threat in the grander scheme of things, enough that your crew is so huge and so powerful that it is recognized as a threat to the entire balance of the world, and something that cannot be easily challenged, which again is clearly established to not be the case with Buggy's fleet, the last that we saw of it. Because just to add some perspective here as to how much it takes to be called an emperor, think about this. Hajrudin and his giants, literally Buggy's best squad, his S-tier mercenaries, they are just one small division out of many divisions of Luffy's grand fleet, and they are not even one of the stronger divisions in the fleet. And Luffy's main crew is way stronger than his fleet. And it took Luffy accumulating all of that manpower, plus Luffy's feats of taking down Katakuri, Doflamingo, and Cracker, all of that combined to finally lead him to being barely sort of being recognized as an emperor. And even then, the Marines did not acknowledge him as an emperor. Not to mention, before Luffy, we saw what it took Blackbeard to become an emperor. Blackbeard, with arguably the two most powerful devil fruits in the world, having just killed Whitebeard and orchestrated the entire Marineford War, having created a crew composed of level 6 inmates who are way stronger than Buggy's fleet. All of that together, and even then Blackbeard was not considered an emperor until he finally defeated the original Whitebeard pirates a full year later and proved his crew's strength. So let's not forget, being called an emperor is really difficult. You need to become such a huge threat that no other emperors or the Marines can easily take you out. And Buggy's fleet of fodder, last we saw, was not that, especially considering he was missing his strongest fighters, the Hajrudin squad. In fact, out of all of the Shichibukai shown in that chapter of the Marines hunting them down, Buggy seemed pretty clearly to be in the worst situation. So all of that evidence points to the idea that something really big must have changed between the Buggy fleet of fodder being about to be wiped off the face of the planet, with Buggy's plans in complete flames and him desperately thinking of just how to survive, to now, with Buggy actually having come out of that whole situation with the highest status imaginable as an Emperor of the Sea. So there are two major possibilities that I can think of. To begin with, either way, it's obvious that Buggy at the very least escaped, and even though his crew was surrounded and basically done for the last we saw, who knows, through some shenanigans and good luck, they somehow escaped and survived. Stranger things have happened. Somehow, whenever Buggy seems done for and captured, some outside factor allows him to get away. So, if they somehow got away, then there are two things that may have happened in the following week to save his reputation and make people start actually calling him an emperor. Either, one, Buggy accidentally did something that made his reputation and perceived threat level go through the roof, or Buggy got some powerful new recruits that beefed up his squad to the point where they are now considered a Yonko crew level threat. So in terms of actually doing something that changed his reputation, what do I mean? Well, knowing that in the week since Kaido was defeated, the world has become a giant mess, maybe Buggy was in some way credited as being responsible for some great event that occurred. What that event could be is anyone's guess. For all we know, he accidentally found the ancient weapon Uranus while searching for Captain John's treasure, and now the world views him as a huge threat. I really have no idea what he might have done. I think that's impossible to speculate on, but it's entirely possible that he caused or was involved in or was credited for something really big that made his perceived threat level skyrocket, the same way that Luffy's did after the events of Whole Cake Island. Now, while we could play that guessing game, on the flip side, we have something maybe a bit more concrete we could look at, which is potential new recruits Buggy added to his crew. And here we look at the fates of the remaining Shichibukai. Because so far, the most consistent reason we've had for Buggy continually falling upwards is his knack for recruiting people much stronger than himself. This began obviously with Impel Down, with many prisoners from the earlier levels falling under his command, even though they were all stronger than him. And while they may not be that strong in the grand scheme of things, Buggy clearly got enough prisoners of decent strength under his command that the world government decided to give him the title of Shichibukai. After all, we know the standards for Shichibukai are generally pretty low. Fast forward to 2 years later, and Buggy has clearly been adding even stronger recruits to his crew, with Hajruden and his giants, who again, even though they are pretty weak in the grand scheme of things, they are clearly an upgrade for his crew, who were previously composed of mainly level 3 and lower Impel Down prison mates, and the Giant Squad are now Buggy's best mercenaries, and with these giants on his side, Buggy has made a name for himself in the New World for having pirate mercenaries for hire. So now that Buggy is somehow being called a Yonko, could this last, biggest, and most mysterious leap in status have been thanks to the addition of some extremely powerful unaffiliated figures? Mihawk is the first character that comes to mind because with the abolition of the warlord system, suddenly he is in the same boat as Buggy, being hunted down by the Marines. And while Mihawk is probably strong enough to survive on his own, just as a sheer matter of convenience, it may have been easier for him to join Buggy's fleet and simply be the big name that scares Marines away, while not having to be just completely out on his own, floating the seas, being hunted day in and day out on his little raft. It really is the perfect fit, as Mihawk doesn't seem interested in leading a crew, he just wants to chill, and Buggy would make for the perfect figurehead, a fake emperor for Mihawk to essentially lend his sword to. I would also add Weevil to that conversation, as Weevil right now is, for me, the single most difficult character in One Piece to figure out, as he has seemingly no clear role in the narrative. Maybe for the moment, with Weevil being hunted down as well, Bakin may have made the simple choice to join up with Buggy and his fleet, providing yet another extremely powerful threat to ward off the Marines. Now, I highly doubt Hancock would join Buggy's fleet because, as far as we know, Hancock respects no men besides Luffy, and would certainly never accept Buggy as her leader, and just some of Oda's mysterious quotes have made it seem like Hancock may actually be in a bad situation right now. But Hancock aside, considering the hype around Weevil as reminiscent of a young Whitebeard, I think if you've got the combination of Mihawk, the world's strongest swordsman, plus Weevil, plus the large numbers of foot soldiers of the Buggy fleet as the cherry on top, all under the flag of a charismatic big name like Buggy, that altogether does seem to make sense as a perceived Emperor caliber crew that came together over the course of the last 7 days. And in fact, it is extremely similar to the scenario we had during the Impel Down jailbreak itself, where you had a bunch of fodder that basically worshipped Buggy as their leader, and then a couple of legitimately strong Shichibukai who were the real powerhouses of the group, with Buggy just riding their coattails while pretending that he was in charge. I could definitely see that identical scenario Buggy had back then playing out right now, just swapping in maybe Mihawk and Weevil instead. So let me know if that makes sense in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video then definitely like and subscribe, and you can get my extended thoughts on this and all future topics on Patreon.